Well, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday evening once again. We are doing a survey through the book of the Esther tonight, but through the entire Bible. We've started, about 17, 18 weeks ago to do this. And obviously it's 66 books in the Bible, so it's going to take us at least that many weeks to get through them all. So tonight is in the book of Esther. We've seen a lot of surveys through the different books that we've started with Genesis, and tonight is one that is a special book of many, of course, in Scripture, but we're going to dive right into it, so I trust you're able to turn to some of the references that we'll talk about here in just a moment. We're going to start off with the author is unknown, though it's been debated that it was Mordecai that was the author of the book, written around 450 BC. And it's the only book in the Bible not to mention specifically the name of God in it, though we find God working throughout the book in various ways. Esther's one story about a woman of Israel who became the queen in a foreign land and stopped the genocide of her people, the Jews, meant to kill them. And what an amazing account as we see. A couple verses to look at for you right now in just a moment. It would be chapter number 5 of the book of Esther. Chapter number 5, and we're going to look at verse number 8. And then we're going to go to chapter 8 and verse number 17. So, Esther chapter 5 and verse number 8. If I have found favor in the sight of my king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet, and I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Esther is trying to talk to the king. Now, the misconception is, or the perception could be that, oh, just because she's the queen meant she could walk into his presence at any time and so on. That's not quite how, especially with a Persian king, how that worked. Even though married to Esther, Esther didn't have just any right that she wanted to walk into his presence. It still had to be one that was granted, and so on. So in this regard, we find that Esther has a petition. She wants to talk to the king, but she makes a feast first, and so on. So if you know the story at all, if not, I would encourage you to read the book of Esther. Chapter number 8 in verse number 17, as I mentioned just a moment ago, states this: in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So this is getting toward the end. Of course, we find that the people were able to defend themselves on that particular day. And so there was great joy, of course, to be had with that proclamation to be able to defend themselves came to pass. Some just important features here in the book of Esther. The book takes place in Susa, east of the Tigris River, which is part of present-day Iraq. It is the only Bible story to take place in the east of what is thought to be the Garden of Eden. Chapters 1 and 2, Esther becomes the queen of Susa. After the former queen, Vashti, does not to honor the king's desire to be a dancing model, basically, before the king and his drunken men. A man named Mordecai had adopted Esther after she was orphaned and became, before she became the queen. Chapter 4 features Mordecai discovering a plot to have all the Jewish people in the kingdom executed, and the evil plot was started by Haman. Esther was able to talk to her husband, a very strong king, out of the genocide through the combination of wit and humility and support from Mordecai. Also, a great request for prayer and fasting. God gave her wisdom, and of course, we know with 2 or 3 days he would come. She prepared him a feast, and so you wonder, as the saying is, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So, but to have the king come and Haman must have been a very delicate situation to be able to talk to the king with Haman. And to again remember, in this society, a woman was not always believed, though she may have been the queen. So she had to be careful and desired a great deal of wisdom. And if you know, asked Mordecai to pray and fast, she would do the same. And so on. Evil Haman ended up being killed on the very device, the gallows, the hanging gallows, that was designed to kill Mordecai. And of course, his desire to have the Jews wiped out became his demise. King Xerxes, Esther's husband, canceled the plot. Well, not really. He could not go back on his word. He couldn't take away that decree, but in that he gave the Jews allowance to have them defend themselves from the people that wanted to kill him. We find Mordecai was promoted as well in this regard. So quite an amazing book as we find the book of Esther. Again, the couple other things. Mordecai has been a popular tradition as far as the author, as I mentioned some time ago. Ezra and Nehemiah, the books that we just finished, would have been familiar with the Persian court system and how all that worked. And so around the same time, if you remember, with both Ezra and Nehemiah, they'd have been around 430, 450 BC, definitely for Nehemiah. So could have been familiar with each other or heard of or whatever, but around the same time period. So they both would have known for sure. The date of writing, again, 450-ish BC. And we find that the book of Esther displays the providence of God, and especially in regard to his chosen people. The book of Esther records the institution of Feast of Purim and the obligation of its perpetual observation. And of course, the book of Esther was read at the Feast of Purim to commemorate the great deliverance of the Jewish people brought by God's providence through Esther. And today, Esther is still read during the Feast of Purim. And truly an amazing book to think. And if you next time you read through the book of Esther, just take some time and do some background study and so on, and just slow it down a bit and read through and think about truly the gravity of the situation that takes place. Let's look at a few more references in the book of Esther. We want to look at chapter 2 and verse number 15 here, if we would follow along. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come into the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. And of course, God giving her favor. Kind of reminds us of Joseph, when God was with Joseph and gave favor with Potiphar, and later on with the prison keeper, and then of course with Pharaoh himself. Chapter number 4, we find in verse number 14, here, for thou art altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there be enlargement and deliverance arise from the Jews of another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is Mordecai talking to Esther, saying, hey, God will deliver, but what's going to happen with you? So who knows? Mordecai says to Esther, who knows if you weren't here, brought here, just for this very purpose? And of course, a very famous question in this from this book. Chapter 6 and verse number 13. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men, and Zeresh, his wife, unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but thou shalt surely fall before him. Ooh, they prophesied. And if you read chapter 6 and learn, of course, that Haman had to go before and announce Mordecai's, it was very embarrassing for him, didn't enjoy it, but they said, hey, you better be careful. Obviously, they understood that their God was, the Jews' God, God of Israel, was with Mordecai. Chapter 7, again in verse 3, then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. The people of Israel may not have been able to have audience with the king, but certainly Esther did on behalf of those that could not speak in audience with the king. The book of Esther can be divided into three main sections, chapters 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 18, where Esther replaces Vashti. Chapter 2, in verse 19 through chapter 7, verse 10, Mordecai overcomes Haman. And then in chapter 8 through chapter 10, verse 3, Israel survived Haman's attempt to destroy them. Esther risks her own life as she realized what was at stake and willing to do what needed to be done, and to, of course, let the king know what the second in command was going to do. She proved a wise and worthy opponent, all the while remaining humble and respectful of the position of her husband, who was the king. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Esther is a story much like the story of Joseph. Both involve foreign monarchs who control the destiny of the Jews. Both accounts show the heroism of an Israelite individual who provides the means of deliverance for the people and the nation. Of course, only through the providence and the help of God. The hand of God is evident in what appears to be a bad situation, indeed, very much under the control of an almighty God who ultimately has the good of his people in his mind. At the center of the story is the ongoing division between the Jews and the Amalekites, who was recorded to have begun the book of Exodus. Haman's goal is the final effort recorded in the Old Testament period to eradicate the Jewish people. His plans eventually ended up with his own demise, hung on the very gallows that he had made for Mordecai. Feasting is a major theme in this book. There are 7 recorded banquets in this book, in chapter 1, chapter 2, 5, 7, 8, and 9. You'll find those, and many events were planned, plotted, and exposed at these banquets. Although the name of God is never mentioned in the book, it is apparent that God was working in his providence with the nation of Israel. Esther asks for fasting and prayer for 3 days before she would go and stand before the king. In spite of the fact that the law allowing their destruction was written according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which meant it could not be reversed, rendering it unchangeable. The way was cleared when the king allowed the Jewish people to defend themselves on that day with no repercussions. So we find some interesting things with Esther. The institution of the Feast of Purim is written and preserved for all to see. It's still observed today, as I mentioned before, and a reminder of the providence and deliverance of God through Esther. Esther was given behind-the-scenes look at the ongoing struggle of Satan against God and his desire to bring the Messiah, of course, and Satan has been opposing God, and we find the first account in the book of Genesis in chapter number 3. Haman plots against the Jews in order to destroy them, and so we find, as we're reminded in the book of 1 Peter, that Satan is as a roaring lion walketh about seeking whom he may devour, and destroy he wishes to do. So he cannot have those who are the children of God, but he certainly still desires to render them useless for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Esther proved to be a godly and teachable spirit that also showed great strength and willingness to obey. Esther's humility was markedly different than the attitude of those around her and caused her to be elevated in position of queen. We know it's all the providence of God, but still Esther had to be willing to follow direction. She showed us that remaining respectful and humble, even in a difficult but not humanly impossible circumstances, often sets us to be a vessel of untold blessing for those around us. We would do well to take heed of the godly attributes that Esther portrays, and as she takes heed of that chamberlain, if you remember, who she found favor in the sight of, and was given instruction on how she could win the favor of the king. So just a few more thoughts as we look at the chapter breakdown for the book of Esther. And we've already talked a little bit about that, but let's take a look. Chapter 1, Queen Vashti disobeys King Xerxes' order. And many could argue that, but I think she did the right thing, and because of what the king had desired in a drunken feast. Certainly not appropriate and honoring to his wife. Esther is made the queen. Haman plots to destroy Mordecai and the Jews. And so that was in chapter 3. In chapter 4, Mordecai seeks help from Queen Esther. Chapter 5, Esther prepares a banquet, and Haman is, of course, not very happy with what's going on. Mordecai is honored by Xerxes for something that was found in the records when the king could not sleep. And so we find that even in that, the providence of God rewards, even much later than sometimes we would like for ourselves. Chapter 7, Esther exposes Haman in the plot. The king, of course, is furious. And if you know anything about what happened, Haman is hung and so on. And not just him, but we find, of course, others suffer the consequence of Haman's actions and decisions. And his house is made a dunghill. Oh, basically his house is turned into an outhouse, a place for refuse storage. Not a good thing, not an honorable thing, if you could imagine. Chapter 8, Xerxes acts on behalf of the Jews and allows them to defend themselves if they were to be attacked on that day. And a decree goes out. And of course, we find that in chapter number 9. And of course, in chapter 10, a tribute to Mordecai and so on. And we see the providential hand of God throughout this book. And what an amazing thing, of course, that we see, and how God works, even though we may not always see and may not always know. But we have learned a lesson in the book of Esther that we can trust God even though we may not see exactly what He's doing and how He's going to work things all out for His glory and for our good. Well, thanks for joining me. We're going to look in the book of Job, another interesting person in the scriptures, and go through the book of Job. A lot of chapters there, but what an amazing book, emotional book, and something, of course, that we can learn from. So thanks for joining me today. Have a great rest of the evening. We'll see you next Wednesday.